So, as I'm sure that you have heard already, Avernus was recently moved all the way down from number 2 to number 4. This means that once again, Silent Clubstep is number 3, and it also means that Avernus was never truly a top 1, meaning that just like how the Golden was placed above Tartarus and then eventually Tartarus is deemed to be harder, Avernus was placed above Acheron and then Acheron eventually prevailed. But the circumstances of this shift are interesting to say the least. Taking our minds back to the second half of 2023, Acheron was the number 1 top demon on the demon list, the hardest level ever completed up to that point. But a couple months before 2.2's release, Avernus was swapped to be above Acheron where it had previously been at number 2, meaning that according to the community at that point, Avernus actually turned out to be the true hardest level beaten in the community. But on top of that, a level that wasn't on the demon list that is undoubtedly harder than both of these levels, that had already been beaten yet not rated, was of course Tidal Wave, and we all know that eventually it would be rated after much drama and placed at number 1 on the demon list. This has left people asking, what is the true final 2.1 top 1 hardest extreme demon in Geometry Dash? Are we only counting rated levels, and if so, wouldn't that be Acheron? Or are we going completely by the community's standards as set by the demon list at that time, meaning it would be Avernus? Or was it really just Tidal Wave all along, not only considering that it was made completely using 2.1 features, but also because it was beaten before 2.2's release, even if it was rated afterwards? All that to say is that's what we're exploring in today's video. If you enjoyed today's video, please remember to like and subscribe. It always helps out the channel and you can undo it later. We are currently in a subscriber race with the population of Liechtenstein, a European country with roughly 39,000 residents, so if you'd like to help out our mission, feel free to subscribe. Also, while you're down there, comment down below, are you Team Avernus, Team Acheron, or Team Tidal Wave? And without further ado, let's get on with the video. So first, I want to real quickly clarify what's been happening with the demon list recently. The reason that Avernus got moved down was partially because of W Popoff's opinion on the level being easier than Acheron, which seems to have finally tipped the scales that were already pretty close. I honestly don't think that this is a situation where there was a ton of bias. Like, Avernus was placed at number 2 because the only real opinion on it was from Zoink, and having only one opinion on the level is not always going to be the most accurate, but then it was moved up to the number 1 spot, and then Diamond beat it a few months later, and it seems like he thinks that the level's top 1, but then Trick beat it a few days later before Tidal Wave was even rated and said it was number 2 below Acheron, which means 2 out of the 3 people who had opinions on the level who had actually beaten the level said it was easier than Acheron. So honestly, this feels like a decision that was much more overdue than people think it is. This wasn't a case where W Popoff single-handedly destroyed the list, although I'm sure he could if he wanted to. So with that out of the way, let's go through the arguments of why each of these 3 candidates could be seen as the final top 1 of 2.1, and which one I personally think makes the most sense. So first up chronologically is Acheron. Acheron was verified by Zoink way before 2.2 was released, and was the undisputed top 1 for quite some time until it was dethroned after over a year of reigning supreme by Avernus. The argument for this level is that if we're going by only rated levels that have been placed on the demon list, Acheron would technically be the finest top 1 hardest rated level beaten in 2.1, and should therefore be considered the final top 1 of Geometry Dash 2.1. The weird thing about this argument is that obviously, if you were to ask someone when 2.2 released what the hardest rated level beaten in 2.1 is, they would probably say Avernus, or they would say fuck the rate system and it's Tidal Wave. So it honestly depends if you believe that we should be looking back at this with a more accurate lens of how difficult the levels are relative to each other, or if we should live in the version that people were going with back when the actual period of events was taking place. Honestly, I think this argument kind of ends up just depending on how you phrase the question. If the question is, what is the final top 1 in Geometry Dash 2.1 that was rated, then I think the answer would more accurately be Avernus because it was top 1 after Acheron. But if you're asking what the hardest level created and beaten in 2.1 was, then I think that award goes to Acheron, because at the end of the day, Acheron is considered harder than Avernus now with more accurate information, and unless they swap again, which let's pray doesn't happen because then this whole video makes 0 sense, that's not going to change and will more accurately reflect how the demon list will look in years to come. Like, let's say there's a new player that starts playing the game in 2025, and at some point they ask what was the final top 1 of 2.1, you know, that period of time where your developer sat on his ass for 6 years. Again, if they don't swap yet again, the answer is probably going to be Acheron. Like, sure, if you went back to the time when the Golden was considered the top 1 at the time, and you asked someone what the hardest level in the game was, they would say the Golden. But if you ask anyone since then, hey, what was the hardest level in that time period, people are going to say Tartarus. And so personally for me, I think it makes more sense to say that Acheron was the hardest rated top 1 in Geometry Dash 2.1, or basically the hardest completed level in 2.1 that was rated, whereas technically the final top 1 on the Pointer Crate Demon list was technically Avernus. Basically picture it as if 2.2 had been released while people thought the Golden was top 1, and then eventually, of course, the Golden and Tartarus were swapped back to their original places, with Tartarus at number 1. And however you treat that situation would probably be how you treat this situation. But then things get more complicated with Tidal Wave. Tidal Wave is in a very unique situation because it is basically undeniably harder than both Avernus and Acheron, and Zoink had already beaten it a few months before 2.2 released, but it was simply just never rated until after 2.2's release. There are a few things that you can objectively say about Tidal Wave. For example, it is the hardest level that was made in 2.1 that was completed in 2.1, but whether or not you say it's the final top 1 is completely dependent on if you think it matters that the rate system heavily factors into what's placed on the demon list. So in summary, if you're going purely off of the pointer grade standards of the time, then Avernus is the final top 1 of 2.1, and if you think it makes more sense to adjust for how the difficulty is perceived today, you would say Acheron, but if they were swapped back, you would still say Avernus. Or if you think the rate system shouldn't be involved in determining what level is the hardest, then you would just say Tidal Wave. Before we continue with today's video, I would like to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, No One. At least not yet. I'd like to announce that I am starting channel memberships. If you want to see my content early, or get extra say in which videos I make, and what topics I cover, or just want to support the channel, then this is definitely the best way to do it, but of course, no pressure. All info is available at the join button down below. Thank you all very, very much, and let's get on with the video. So, which category do I personally fall into, and which one do I think makes the most sense? Well, like I said before, it honestly, to me, feels like it really depends on how you perceive the hardest level in the game and what determines it. For example, there are other lists out there that are not pointer crate that still keep track of the hardest classic mode levels. And for a lot of people, that matters more to them than what pointer crate says, and so the conversation would be completely different to them. To my knowledge, there are some of those lists that didn't have Avernus above Acheron, or had placed Tidal Wave way before it was rated because they simply do not care whether Rob Top rated it or not. So personally, at least in my mind, and this is just my personal take on the situation, it's not fact, I think it makes the most sense to say that Tidal Wave was the final 2.1 top 1. Because first off, it does seem like it was the hardest level ever beaten in the 2.1 era of the game, even including challenges like VSC, for example. And that's true whether it was rated or not. And on top of that, if it had been rated when it was verified, or basically any time before 2.2's release date, it would have 100% been placed at number 1 above both Avernus and Acheron. So in my mind, it makes the most sense to say that Tidal Wave was the final top 1 of 2.1. But for technicality's sake, I would say if you're going purely by what pointer crate says, that it makes the most sense to say that Avernus was the final top 1 in 2.1, but Acheron was the hardest top 1 in 2.1, if that makes sense. Because those two are not necessarily the same thing. They're, I guess, slightly different titles. But overall, at least to me, it feels like Tidal Wave is the final top 1 of 2.1. Of course, that isn't to say that there isn't validity to the other two levels being the level that you support as the final top 1. It honestly doesn't matter. This is one of those situations where really it just depends on how you look at it, and there are equally valid positions to take for each of the 3 levels. And so yeah, that's it for today's video. If you did enjoy, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton, yada, you get the whole idea. This has been your daily dose of geometry-yapping. If you'd like to, you could join my Discord server, the link is in the description. And while you're down there, again, if you are interested, channel memberships are now available. Of course, no pressure, but if you don't do it, then me and my hungry kids will starve. Seriously though, thank you all so much for watching and the recent support on the channel, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye!